Paul Anthony Wallis is a popular speaker, a researcher, and author of books on spirituality and mysticism. His work probes the world's mythologies for their insight into human origins and human potential. He's also a healing practitioner and has worked as a theological educator, training pastors in the interpretation of texts, and also as an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And he recently released a controversial book in the same mould as The Chariots of Fire called Escape from Eden. Paul joins us now. Hello, Paul.
G'day, Dean. Thanks for having me on your show.
Absolute pleasure, Paul. Been meaning to speak with you for quite some time, and the book you released back in May, Escape from Eden, has certainly caused a bit of a stir around the place. But the first question I just wanted to ask you is why you wrote it.
Certainly. The first reason was an ultimate frisbee injury, which is a code in the book for all the times when the universe has given me some time to do some actual study. And I knew that the next time I had some time and some opportunity, there was something I wanted to get back to and take a look at that had been rumbling away in the back of my mind for a long time. And it goes right back to when I was 11 years old, and I first encountered Erich von Däniken, author of Chariots of the Gods, and it was being discussed at a dinner party that my mum and dad were hosting, and my ears pricked up when I heard this conversation, because I had always thought there was an anomaly in the story of us, that there was a gap in our ability to explain ourselves as an intelligent, conscious, technological species. And Erich von Däniken had put his finger on that. At my school, which was a Church of England school, I felt that the religious answers I was getting were a bit lazy. God made us, didn't quite seem to explain why we're so clearly an animal like the other animals, only a little different. And then when I went to science for an answer, it couldn't quite explain where our consciousness and higher intelligence had suddenly come from, because it's only because of that that we're at the top of the tree. And Erich von Däniken pointed out this anomaly and suggested that an external intervention in our evolution would make sense of both those questions. And that made sense to me. It actually led me in a funny way to becoming a Christian. And I was in ministry for 33 years and very involved in preaching from the Bible. In fact, I taught courses to pastors in training on how to interpret ancient texts, the Bible in particular. I worked as a church doctor, an archdeacon in the Anglican Church. And in all that time, I had the opportunity to teach from the Old Testament. And I taught through the book of Genesis many times. And each time I did it, there were questions that bothered me, funny anomalies in the story, the kind of things any child would point out if you sit down with the Bible and read to them. So why does it say, let us make the humans to look like one of us? Well, one of who? And then the snake suddenly appears with no introduction. Who's that? And couldn't God see something was going to go wrong? Why didn't he anticipate that? Why is it the death penalty for eating a piece of fruit? Now we've got a genocide in Genesis 6. Explain a loving God and a genocide to a child, and you'll get into some tongue twisters. And as a preacher, you do your best to make sense of it, but each time I did that, I thought, no, there's something else going on in these texts. I nearly need to dig deeper into these and work out what's the real story, what's actually going on here, because these stories don't work as moral tales. You can't read them in a fundamentalist way and correlate them with anything. So what's the right handling of this? And then a gauntlet was thrown down in 2009 when the Roman Catholic Church convened a colloquium. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences had this symposium for 5 days to discuss, and here was the title, The Theological Implications of Contact with Other Civilizations. And I was blown away that they were having that conversation. And then when people came from that symposium and met the press on behalf of the Vatican, they were basically saying there's no issue. We should all be ready to embrace a brother or sister alien. We shouldn't be surprised to meet them because they're in the Bible after all. They're in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I thought, could I really have missed something as glaring as aliens in the Bible? So when I had my ultimate frisbee injury and had the opportunity to sit down and do some deeper study, that was the gauntlet I took up. I
Yeah.
went back to Eden, back to the texts to ask, are there really aliens in the Bible? And when I did a little bit of translation work, it became very clear that the ET presence in the Bible begins in the first two verses
Hmm.
and doesn't disappear until the end of Revelation. And that was the beginning of escaping from Eden.
Did you expect to be led to a world of extraterrestrials when you started that research?
Not to the extent that that happened. No, I had an idea that there may be an alien or two rumbling around somewhere in the text. Bible readers would be familiar with Genesis chapter 6, which is a story of hybridization between human beings and something else called the Bene Elohim. And that story of hybridization between humans and higher beings is in mythologies all around the world. So when I went back to do the study, I thought, well, maybe Reverend Dr. Guy Consolmagno, who said this is in the Bible, he's talking about that. But it's actually far, far bigger than that. And as I say, it begins right at the beginning and it ends right at the end. And it's like taking the red pill. When you do the translation work, it opens up a completely new world and you can't go back to reading it the old way. So it was a surprise to me what I found, and then working through the implications of it and finding correlations in contemporary science, etc. It really has shifted my worldview in a very exciting and dramatic way.
Hmm. But it doesn't make you any less a Christian, does it?
Well, not in my opinion, but it depends who you ask. But I still am a believer in Jesus. I seek to live my life by his teachings. I believe in God. But how that's framed does alter when the big picture changes and you realize that you're living in a universe that's more populated than you thought it was. And stories that you thought were about God in the Old Testament turn out to be about something completely different.
Hmm. I mean, I always encourage people to question everything. And I mean, as I mentioned to you before we started this interview, I was dressed down by a Catholic priest in elementary or primary school. I was only 10 years old, and I asked the question during a religious instructions class of if God can be anywhere, anytime by just twitching an eyelid, why does he need a fiery chariot to move around in? It just didn't, I mean, even then it didn't
Yeah,
make sense to me. And I
it's
missed
a
the
good
next month of
question.
that class. I mean, I was basically put in a room by myself while that went on for 2 hours every week.
That may have been a mercy, Dean. But I'm interested, the fiery chariot that you were talking about, which one was that? Because there are a few interesting moments,
Yeah,
aren't there, in the Old Testament when they turn up?
the one that really kind of bugged me was when Moses went up the mountain, and and he was met by the big ball of fire, um, and then was taken on board, and he was gone for a while. And I always thought, well, I mean, couldn't God just zap him up to heaven if that's where he wanted
Yes,
him to be, and then show him what he wanted him to teach?
yes. Yes, that's right. There are a few moments like that where if you're just reading it without any preconceptions, you'll say, what technology is that? It's when we come to the text with religious expectations that we think, oh, this must be a metaphor. Uh, but you take the plain meaning of what you're reading, and you've got fire, you've got smoke, you've got noise, you've got a vehicle. And it's interesting in that moment with Moses, God says to Moses, when I come back, I'll come back in my Shekinah. And that gets translated as glory. But if you dig down into the etymology of that, a Shekinah is a big, heavy thing that clearly flies. And the other place that this big, heavy thing that flies is mentioned is in the prophet Ezekiel,
Hmm.
where he gets picked up in the big, heavy thing that flies, and he describes the flying journeys it takes him on. And that's a really funny episode because they're the pilot who Ezekiel describes as being like a human being is trying to talk to him about religion and politics, but Ezekiel is fixated by the big heavy thing and how it works, the noise it makes, this glass canopy, he's never seen anything like it, how the wheels work. And he's clearly looking at a piece of technology, which he is really describing. So you asked a very, very obvious and good question. What's this technology? Why does God need it? And it's disappointing, let's be honest, that you were responded to in that way, because anyone who studies theology, and a Roman Catholic priest will study it for 7 years, will have read these texts and will know that they are based on Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian texts that don't have God in them. They have beings from another planet in them who have technology with which they arrive and manage Project Earth. Those are the stories that the ancient Bible stories are based on. And I think it's a shame that your priest couldn't have a conversation with you about that.
He was a pretty fiery Irishman, so I didn't want to push him too far. But anyway, yeah, and even my lovely wife, I mean, she's very, very spiritual and faith-based, and I mean, so am I. But she's got God in the box, and I haven't. So we'll get into a little, back and forth, and not far into an argument. I don't want it to ever lead into an argument, but I just back off, and I think she just needs to grow a bit more in her.
Well, people have different ways in to the topic. And for me, I've mentioned a couple of ways, but another way is if you do have a faith in Jesus, then immediately that's going to give you questions about the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament. Because if God is as Jesus suggests he is, then you go back to the old stories of Genesis and further into the Hebrew Scriptures, and you think, well, that can't be right. This can't be a story about God. So what is it about? And for many of the early church fathers, right at the beginning of Christianity, that was how they got into this ET narrative, by beginning with Jesus. But I now find I'm meeting with people who get into this territory from all sorts of start points, either through a study of archaeology, neurology, study of mythologies, astronomy, DNA research. There are so many ways that people can study, and they'll swallow a red pill, a new picture will open up, and they'll suddenly realize, oh, there are other entities in this big world that I've just been exposed to. And often we will meet in a discussion about ETs or UFOs or abduction stories and realize we've come from all these different start points to the realization that this is what we're looking at.
Theologian and author Patrick Cook once said that gods have been mistaken for aliens rather than the other way around. I mean, would you agree with that?
Gods have been mistaken for aliens rather than the other way around. Well, for me, my answer to that really begins with the texts and understanding what the texts say and what the texts are about. And it's been a really fun and exciting journey for me, discovering the correlations among texts, narratives from all around the world. And in those, I find stories about other kinds of being that then get interpreted as gods. So I guess that's the way around I've seen it.